It was a rainy night in Seattle, the kind of night where the streets gleamed with the glow of streetlights reflecting off puddles. The screeching sound of tires suddenly cut through the air, echoing eerily against the tall buildings. A shiny silver Aston Martin skidded to a stop, its wheels splashing water onto the empty street. The car halted just inches from a figure stumbling across the road. Dorian Reeves, the driver, gripped the steering wheel tightly. His heart was pounding as if it might leap out of his chest. For a terrifying moment, he thought he had hit someone. Slowly, he exhaled, unclipped his seatbelt, and stepped out into the rain. The drizzle quickly soaked his expensive Armani suit, but he didn't care. A few feet ahead, illuminated by the flickering glow of a street lamp, stood a young woman. She was leaning against the pole, her shoulders shaking as she cried. Her flowery dress clung to her in the rain, and it was impossible to miss her swollen belly. She was pregnant, and she looked like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Dorian's breath caught. "My God," he muttered under his breath. "Are you all right?" he called out, stepping cautiously closer. The woman didn't respond. She seemed to be in her own world, lost in despair. Her sobs mingled with the sound of rain, creating a melody of sadness. "Ma'am?" Dorian tried again, his voice softer this time. He held out his hand, but made no move to touch her. "Can I help you?" This time, she lifted her head, startled. Her brown eyes, wide with fear and surprise, locked onto his. For a moment, Dorian felt like time stood still. There was something in her gaze, a mixture of strength and vulnerability, that stirred something deep inside him. I have nowhere to go," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost drowned out by the rain. Dorian hesitated. His whole life was about control and plans. As the CEO of Reeves Technologies and one of the wealthiest men in the country, he wasn't used to acting on impulse. Yet something about this woman, standing alone and pregnant in the rain, tugged at his heart in a way he didn't understand. "Come with me," he said, the words escaping before he had time to think. "I know a safe place where you can stay tonight." The woman's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across her face. "Who are you?" "My name is Dorian Reeves," he replied, his tone calm and steady. "I promise I won't hurt you. I just want to help." She hesitated, her gaze flicking between him and his car. Dorian could almost see the battle raging within her, fear versus the desperate need for help. Finally, with a shaky nod, she said, "Elowen, my name is Elowen." Relieved, Dorian opened the passenger door for her. She slid into the car hesitantly, her hands resting protectively on her belly. As he walked around to the driver's seat, he couldn't help but notice how out of place she looked in the luxurious leather interior. She was drenched, fragile, and trembling, a stark contrast to the polished luxury of the Aston Martin. He turned on the heater and pulled back onto the road. For a while, the car was silent, except for the sound of rain pattering against the roof and Elowen's ragged breathing. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice still shaky. Dorian paused. He hadn't really thought about it. A hotel? No, that felt too impersonal. A shelter? That didn't seem right either. Then an idea struck him. "My house," he said, surprising even himself. "You can stay in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow, we'll figure out a more permanent solution." Elowen stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Your house? But you don't even know me. What if I'm dangerous?" Dorian smiled faintly, a hint of humor breaking through the tense atmosphere. "Considering I'm the one taking a stranger home, I think I'm the one who should be worried." To his surprise, Elowen let out a small, soft laugh. It was brief, but it lit up her face in a way that made Dorian's heart skip a beat. The drive through the rainy streets of Seattle continued in silence. Elowen stared out the window, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Her hands never left her belly, and Dorian noticed a faint tremble in her fingers. "How far along are you?" he asked gently, breaking the silence. 7 months, she replied, her voice quiet. She didn't elaborate, and Dorian decided not to press. It was clear she had been through a lot. Soon they arrived at Dorian's building, a tall, modern condominium in Bellevue with stunning views of Lake Washington. He parked in the underground garage and led Elowen to the private elevator. When the doors opened directly into his penthouse, Elowen gasped softly. The apartment was breathtaking, with its clean, modern design and floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the glittering city lights. It was the kind of place most people only dreamed about. "This way," Dorian said, leading her down a hallway to the guest room. The room was spacious and warm, with a large bed, soft lighting, and an ensuite bathroom. He opened a cupboard, pulling out clean towels and a robe. "You can dry off and warm up here," he said, placing the items on the bed. "There are toiletries in the bathroom. Use whatever you need. I'll find some clothes for you." Elowen stood in the doorway, her eyes brimming with tears. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You don't even know me." Dorian paused, considering her question. Why was he doing this? It wasn't like him to act on a whim or let a stranger into his carefully organized life. Yet here he was. "Because sometimes people need help," he said finally. "And sometimes we're in a position to give it. I have more than I need. If I can help, why shouldn't I?" Elowen nodded, her tears spilling over. "Thank you," she whispered. Dorian gave her a small nod and stepped out of the room, closing the door behind him. He leaned against it for a moment, his mind racing. What had he just done? His orderly, predictable life had just taken a turn he hadn't seen coming. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the penthouse windows. Elowen woke up, momentarily disoriented by the luxurious surroundings. The events of the previous night came rushing back, the rain, her despair, and Dorian's unexpected kindness. She dressed in the clean clothes Dorian had left for her and made her way to the kitchen. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and something sweet greeted her. Dorian stood at the stove, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt. He looked completely different from the drenched businessman she had met the night before. "Good morning," she said softly. Dorian turned, smiling warmly. "Good morning. I hope you slept well. Breakfast is almost ready. Please sit." Elowen sat at the kitchen counter, watching him move around the space. The pancakes he placed before her were golden and perfect, and the smell made her stomach rumble. "Do you always cook?" she asked, curious. Dorian chuckled. "Not often, but today felt like a good day to bring back an old habit." For a while they ate in silence. Finally, Dorian set his fork down and said, "I think we need to talk." Elowen froze, her appetite vanishing. She knew this moment was coming, but it still felt overwhelming. "I don't know where to start," she said quietly. "Start at the beginning," Dorian suggested gently. "How did you end up on that street last night?" Taking a deep breath, Elowen began. She told him about her life in Portland, her dreams of becoming a nurse, and how everything had changed when she met Thaddeus. She explained how he had promised her love and support, but vanished when she became pregnant. She spoke about her parents, who had disowned her when she refused to terminate the pregnancy, and how she had come to Seattle hoping for a fresh start. Tears filled her eyes as she described the series of challenges that followed: losing jobs, staying in shelters, and finally being kicked out of her rented room the night before. "I had nowhere to go," she finished, her voice breaking. Dorian listened intently, his expression a mix of compassion and quiet anger at the injustice she had faced. When she was done, he placed a hand over hers, offering silent support. "You've been through so much," he said softly. "No one should have to face that." Elowen looked up and met Dorian's eyes. There was something special there, a kindness and seriousness that surprised her. "Why are you helping me?" she asked again, just like she did the night before. "You could have just left me there or taken me to a shelter." Dorian pulled his hand away and ran it through his hair, looking a bit nervous. "Honestly, I don't know. Seeing you alone in the rain reminded me of something." "Of what?" Elowen asked softly, curious about the change in his voice. Dorian was quiet for a while, a lot like he was deciding whether to tell her. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and full of emotion. My sister, she was pregnant when she died. It was a car accident. I was so busy with my work, I didn't spend enough time with her. When I got the call, he stopped, swallowing hard. Let's just say there are some things money can't fix. Elowen felt her heart ache for him. She gently touched his arm. I'm sorry for your loss, she said. Dorian gave her a small, sad smile. It happened a long time ago, but I guess helping you is a way for me to, I don't know, make peace with the past. They sat quietly for a while, his words hanging in the air. Then Dorian sat up straighter, looking determined. Now, the question is, how can we improve your situation? You said you were studying nursing. Is that something you still want to do? Elowen blinked, surprised by the sudden change in subject. I'd love to, but with the baby coming, I don't know how. Leave that to me, Dorian said gently. I know people at the University of Washington. I'm sure we can figure something out, like a flexible study program or online classes. But what about housing? What about expenses? I can't accept this, Elowen protested. Dorian cut her off again, his voice firm but kind. You're in a tough spot, but it's not hopeless. Let me help you. Think of this as an investment in your future and your baby's future. Elowen's eyes filled with tears, this time from gratitude and hope. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, Dorian said with a warm smile. Just promise me you'll try your best. And one day, when you're in a good place, help someone else who needs it, just like I'm helping you now. At that moment, sitting in Dorian's fancy kitchen, Elowen felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for a better future, for a chance to follow her dreams and to give her baby a good life. I promise, she said softly, her voice full of emotion. Dorian smiled brightly. Good. Now how about another pancake? We have a lot to plan. As he got up to get more food, Elowen couldn't help but think how quickly life could change. Yesterday, she was alone and scared. Today, she had someone to help her and a little hope for the future. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in months, she was excited to find out. In the weeks that followed, Elowen's life started to feel different. It was strange at first, but soon her new routine began to feel right. Dorian had kept his word. He made calls and got her into an online nursing program at the University of Washington. It allowed her to study from home while getting ready for the baby. Dorian let her stay in a guest room in his big, fancy apartment. It wasn't as grand as the rest of the place, but for Elowen, it felt like a palace compared to the tiny rooms and shelters she had stayed in before. One Saturday morning, Elowen was sitting on the little balcony outside her room. She had a cup of ginger tea resting on her growing belly as she read a book for her studies. A soft knock at the door made her look up. May I come in? Dorian's voice called from outside. Of course, Elowen said, closing her book and sitting up straighter. Dorian came in, holding a small box. He looked a little nervous, which was unusual for him. I brought you something, he said, holding out the box. Curious, Elowen opened it. Inside was a shiny new smartphone. She looked up at Dorian, confused. I noticed you didn't have a phone, he explained quickly. I thought it might help with your studies, staying in touch with your teachers, and, well, for emergencies. Elowen felt her throat tighten with emotion. It was such a simple gift, but it meant so much. Dorian, this is too much. You've already done so much for me. Please, he said, gently interrupting her. Take it. Think of it as something you need for school. After a moment, Elowen nodded, a shy smile on her face. Thank you. This means a lot. Dorian looked relieved. He sat down in the chair next to her, his eyes drifting to the city view. How are your studies going? Good, Elowen said, her excitement showing. It's hard, especially with the baby on the way, but it feels good to have something to work toward. Dorian nodded. And how are you feeling? How's the baby? We're both fine, Elowen said with a smile, her hand resting on her belly. I have an ultrasound appointment next week. I'll finally find out if it's a boy or a girl." They sat quietly for a moment, the noise of the city faint in the background. Elowen glanced at Dorian. He seemed more relaxed, softer than when they first met. "Dorian," she asked hesitantly, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course," he said, looking curious. "Why didn't you ever get married or have kids?" The question caught Dorian off guard. He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the city. When he finally spoke, his voice was full of emotion. "I think I got lost along the way," he said softly. "I spent so much time building my business that I forgot to build a life, and when I finally realized it," he sighed. "I thought it was too late." Elowen felt a wave of sympathy for him. "It's never too late," she said gently. Dorian turned to her with a small, sad smile. "Maybe you're right, but what about you? Any regrets about all this?" He nodded toward her belly. Elowen thought for a moment. "Honestly, no. It wasn't what I planned, but this baby." She smiled, rubbing her belly. "He or she is the best thing that ever happened to me. It made me stronger, it made me fight, and it brought me here." Dorian's eyes softened, and Elowen saw an expression she couldn't quite understand. "You're an amazing woman, Elowen. Your baby is lucky to have you as a mom." Elowen felt her cheeks grow warm at the compliment. "Thank you, and thank you for everything you're doing for us." Dorian waved his hand as if brushing off her thanks. "It's the least I can do. Actually, He hesitated, looking nervous again. "I was wondering if, maybe, I could come with you to your ultrasound appointment. Just to support you." Elowen was surprised by his request. Part of her wanted to say no, that she could handle it on her own. But another part of her, one she didn't want to think too much about, welcomed the idea. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Thank you." Dorian's face lit up with a big smile. "Great, it's a date then." As soon as he said it, Dorian seemed to realize his mistake. His face turned red and he started to stammer. "I mean, not a date, just a doctor's appointment. You know what I mean." Elowen laughed, finding his flustered reaction funny. "I know what you mean, Dorian. Don't worry." He stood up quickly, still looking embarrassed. "Well, I should go. I have some emails to answer. See you at dinner." Elowen nodded, still smiling. "See you later." After he left, Elowen leaned back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. What was happening? She had come to Dorian's apartment as a stranger needing help. Now, just a few weeks later, she found herself looking forward to spending time with him. She tried to push those thoughts away. It was silly. Dorian was just being kind, helping her because of a promise he made to himself. That was all, right? With a sigh, Elowen turned back to her book, trying to focus on her studies. Elowen had a lot of work to do. She had to build a future for herself and her baby. There was no space in her life for silly dreams about romance. But as she tried to read the words in her book, her thoughts kept wandering back to Dorian. She remembered his smile and how his eyes lit up when he talked to her. No matter how hard she tried to focus, she couldn't help but think, what if? What if there was something more happening? What if, against all odds, she wasn't just finding someone to help her, but something more special? Shaking her head, Elowen told herself to stop thinking like that. She had to focus on her book and her future. She had a baby to prepare for. There would be time for other things later. Still, as the afternoon turned to evening, Elowen couldn't stop a small smile from forming on her face. A warm feeling spread through her chest every time she thought of Dorian. Maybe, just maybe, life had more surprises for her than she ever imagined. The day of her ultrasound appointment came faster than Elowen expected. She sat in the clinic's waiting room, her hands smoothing the fabric of her blouse over her big belly again and again. Dorian sat next to her, looking just as nervous. His fingers drummed quietly on the arm of the chair. "Are you okay?" Elowen asked softly, noticing how tense he looked. Dorian turned to her with a smile that didn't look real. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little nervous, I guess. This is a big deal, isn't it?" Elowen nodded, feeling grateful he was there. Over the past few weeks, Dorian had become more than just the person helping her out. He was her friend, someone she could talk to, and a steady presence in her busy life. Elowyn Carter, the nurse called out. Elowyn stood up with Dorian right behind her. As they walked into the examination room, she felt his hand lightly touch her back. It was such a small gesture that it might have been an accident, but it sent a shiver through her. Lying on the examination table with cold gel on her belly, Elowyn held her breath as the technician moved a wand over her skin. The sound of the baby's heartbeat filled the room, and tears came to Elowyn's eyes. "Look," the technician said, smiling and pointing to the screen. "That's your baby." Elowyn turned her head to see. Her breath caught in her throat. There on the screen was her baby. She could see the face, the tiny hands, and the little feet kicking. "Dorian," she whispered, reaching out blindly. Dorian took her hand right away, his fingers wrapping around hers. "It's incredible," he said, his voice filled with emotion. The technician smiled. "Would you like to know the baby's gender?" Elowyn looked at Dorian. He nodded, encouraging her. "Yes, please," Elowyn said. There was a short pause as the technician moved the wand to find the right angle. Then she smiled and said, "Congratulations, it's a girl." Elowyn felt tears running down her cheeks. "A girl," she whispered. She was going to have a daughter. "A little girl," Dorian said softly, his voice full of admiration. Elowyn glanced at him and was surprised to see tears in his eyes, too. The rest of the appointment went by quickly. Elowyn barely heard the technician's explanations about the baby's growth. She was still trying to process that she was going to have a daughter. When they left the clinic, Elowyn felt like she was floating. Dorian guided her gently to the car, his hand never leaving her back. "So," he said as he started driving, "a girl. Have you thought of any names?" Elowyn smiled, rubbing her belly. "Yes, I was thinking of Isolde. It means wisdom." Dorian nodded, a soft smile on his face. Isolde is a beautiful name. They drove in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Elowyn noticed Dorian looked different, softer, more open. It was as if seeing the baby had changed something in him. Suddenly, Dorian turned to the car in a different direction. "Where are we going?" Elowyn asked. "I thought maybe we could celebrate," Dorian said, sounding a little nervous. "There's a small cafe nearby. They make the best waffles in town." Elowyn's heart raced. This felt like a date. "That sounds great," she said softly. The cafe was cozy and smelled like coffee and waffles. Sitting at a small table in the corner, Elowyn started to relax. She laughed as Dorian told her funny stories about his younger days. "There I was, 20-something, thinking I knew everything," he said, shaking his head. "I was so full of myself. And now," Elowyn teased, a smile on her face, a smile and looked at her, his eyes soft. "Now I know I don't have all the answers. In fact, the older I get, the less I know for sure." His words made Elowyn's heart feel warm. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his on the table. "Sometimes not knowing all the answers is good," she said gently. "It leaves room for surprises." Dorian's eyes met hers, and for a moment, everything else seemed to disappear. Elowyn's heart raced, and she felt like it would be so easy to lean forward and close the gap between them. But then the waitress brought their plates of waffles, breaking the moment. Elowyn pulled her hand back, her cheeks warm. They ate their food, talking and laughing, but there was something unspoken in the air between them. When they got back to Dorian's apartment, the sky was painted in pinks and golds. Standing in the doorway of Elowyn's room, the air felt heavy with unspoken possibilities. "Thank you for today," Elowyn said softly. "For everything." Dorian smiled, his eyes warm. "It's been my pleasure. Thank you for letting me be a part of it. It's special." There was a long pause, filled with thoughts neither of them said aloud. Then Dorian stepped back, his smile a little shaky. "Good night, Elowyn. Get some rest." "Good night, Dorian," she replied. She watched him walk away before closing her door and leaning against it. Her heart and mind were a whirlwind of emotions. What was going on between them? Was it just kindness, or was it something deeper? Lying in bed, her hands on her belly where her baby Isolde was growing, Elowen thought about the future. What would it bring? How would her life change? And Dorian, what part would he play in it all? With a sigh, she closed her eyes, letting herself dream of her little girl and Dorian's kind smile. Dorian walked into the room, holding 2 steaming cups of tea. "I thought you might like some tea," he said, putting a cup on the table next to Elowen. She smiled and said, "Thank you. You're a lifesaver." He sat down beside her on the sofa, looking at all the books and papers spread out. "How's the studying going?" he asked. "Slowly," Elowen said with a sigh, closing her laptop. "It's hard to concentrate when it feels like there's a soccer player in my belly." Dorian chuckled. "Is Isolde kicking a lot today?" "As always," Elowen replied with a smile, rubbing her baby bump. "I think she's excited to come out and see the world." They sipped their tea quietly for a while. Elowen noticed how these peaceful moments with Dorian had become special to her. Over the past few months, their friendship had grown into something deeper. "Elowen," Dorian said softly. His voice sounded serious. She looked at him and saw he seemed nervous. "There's something I want to talk about." "What is it?" she asked. He set his cup down and held his hands together. "I've been thinking about what will happen when Isolde is born, about your future, about her future." Elowen's heart started beating faster. She had thought about this too, but didn't want to bring it up. "I know I can't stay here forever," she began, but Dorian interrupted her gently. "That's what I want to talk about. I'd like you to stay, not just for a little while after Isolde is born. I mean, forever." Elowen's eyes widened in surprise. "Dorian, I can't accept that. You've already done so much for me and Isolde." "Please listen," he said, looking into her eyes. "These past months, having you here has changed my life. For the first time in years, I feel happy and whole." Elowen felt her breath catch. His gaze was full of feelings she hadn't noticed before. "I know this sounds crazy," he continued, "but I want to be a part of your lives. Not just as a friend or someone who helps you, but something more. Elowen, I've fallen in love with you and with Isolde." Elowen's heart felt like it might burst. Part of her wanted to hug him and say she felt the same. But another part, the cautious part, wasn't sure. "Dorian, I don't know what to say. This is a lot to think about." "You don't have to say anything now," he said, squeezing her hands gently. "Just know that my offer stands. This is your home, Isolde's home, for as long as you want." Elowen nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Dorian gave her a small smile before standing up. "I'll let you think about it," he said, walking out of the room. As she sat there, her mind was spinning. Dorian's words echoed in her ears. A home. He wasn't just offering a place to stay, he was offering a real home. She thought about all their moments together, late night talks, laughter over breakfast, and how his eyes lit up whenever she entered the room. She thought about his kindness, how he always put her first, how he had become her rock. Suddenly, she realized something. She loved him too. Maybe she had loved him for a long time, but hadn't noticed. Elowen stood up, one hand on her belly. "What do you think, Isolde?" She asked softly. "Should we give this a chance?" Isolde gave a big, strong kick. Elowen laughed. "I think that's a yes." With new determination, she walked to Dorian's office. Standing in the doorway, she watched him. He looked deep in thought, sitting at his desk. "Dorian," she called gently. He looked up, and his eyes were full of hope and worry. "Elowen, She crossed the room and stood in front of him. "You're right," she said, her voice trembling a little. "It's complicated. There's a lot to figure out, but..." She took his hand and placed it on her belly. "We can't imagine our lives without you in it." Dorian's smile lit up the room. He stood and pulled her into a hug as close as her baby bump would allow. "Are you sure?" he asked. Elowen nodded, tears in her eyes. "I am. We love you, Dorian. I love you." Dorian leaned down and kissed her, soft and full of love. When they pulled apart, they were both laughing and crying at the same time. For the first time in a long time, Elowen felt like she could see a happy future ahead, a future filled with love and family. "So," Dorian said with a grin, resting his forehead against hers, "what do we do now?" "Now?" Elowen smiled back. "Now, we live." As the golden sunset filled the room, Elowen knew they would face anything the future held together. She, Dorian, and baby Isolde. 3 months later, a baby's cry filled the apartment. Elowen woke up immediately, even though she was so tired. But before she could get out of bed, she felt Dorian's hand on her shoulder. "Rest," he said sleepily. "I'll go." Elowen smiled in the dark and watched Dorian get up quietly. She listened through the baby monitor as he reached Isolde's crib. "Hello, little princess," Dorian said softly. "What's wrong? Are you hungry, or do you just want some company?" Isolde's cries turned to little hiccups, then happy sounds, as Dorian hummed her a lullaby. Elowen's heart swelled with love. 3 months had passed since Isolde was born, and every day brought new surprises and challenges. Being a dad wasn't always easy for Dorian. There were times he worried, like when Isolde got sick, and times they disagreed on how to do things. But through it all, their love grew stronger. Elowen turned in bed and looked at a photo on her bedside table. It was the day they brought Isolde home from the hospital. In the picture, Dorian held baby Isolde, his eyes full of happy tears, while Elowen smiled beside him. Dorian came back to bed and pulled Elowen close. "Is she okay?" she asked. "She's perfect," Dorian said, kissing her forehead. "She just wanted a little attention, just like her mom." Elowen laughed softly. "Silly." They lay quietly for a moment before Dorian spoke. "You know," he said, sounding thoughtful, "I've been thinking." "Hmm?" Elowen murmured, already drifting off again. "Maybe it's time for a change." That woke Elowen up. She propped herself up on one elbow. "What kind of change?" Dorian took a deep breath. "I love this apartment, but I don't think it's the best place to raise a family. Maybe we should look for a house, something with a yard, maybe near a park." Elowen felt so many feelings all at once, excited, nervous, and a little scared. Dorian noticed and said, "Do you want us to move?" "Only if you want to," he quickly added. "It's just an idea. I thought we could give Isolde more space to grow and play." He paused and said softly, "Maybe we could think about having more kids one day." Elowen's heart skipped a beat. They had never talked about having more children before. The idea scared her, but it also made her happy. She looked at him and asked, "Dorian, do you want more kids?" He held her hand tightly and said, "I want everything with you, Elowen. A house full of laughter, a yard full of toys, a life full of memories, but only if you want that too." Elowen felt tears in her eyes. Just a year ago, she had been alone, pregnant, and feeling hopeless. Now she had a man who loved her, a beautiful daughter, and a bright future ahead. "I do," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I want everything with you." Dorian smiled and kissed her deeply. When they pulled away, both were smiling and out of breath. "Then it's decided," he said. "Tomorrow we'll start looking for a new home." Elowen nodded, snuggling close to him as she began to fall asleep. She thought about how unexpected life could be. A rainy night had changed everything for her. The next few days were busy. Between feeding and changing Isolde, they spent hours looking at houses online and talking about schools and neighborhoods. Every house they saw gave them new dreams for the future. One sunny Saturday, while Dorian fed Isolde, Elowen was flipping through a real estate catalog when the phone rang. It was their real estate agent, Mrs. Carter. "I have great news," Mrs. Carter said. "I just found a house that's perfect for you. It's on Mercer Island, near the lake. It has 4 bedrooms, a big backyard, and it's close to a park." Elowen looked excitedly at Dorian. "Can we see it today?" she asked. "Of course," Mrs. Carter replied. "I can meet you there in an hour." Suddenly, everything became busy. They got Isolde ready, packed her bag, and found the car keys. In the middle of the chaos, Elowen saw Dorian making funny faces to make Isolde laugh. "Hey," she called softly. When he looked up, she smiled. "I love you," both of you." Dorian's smile was bright. "We love you too," he said. As they drove to Mercer Island, the sun sparkled on the water. Elowen felt hopeful. It didn't matter if this house was perfect or not. What mattered was that they were together, building a life as a family. When they arrived, Elowen gasped. The house was beautiful. It had 2 floors, big windows, a wide porch, and a backyard just right for swings and toys. This keeps the story intact as you originally provided. As they walked through the house, Dorian's eyes lit up. He pointed out where they could put a Christmas tree, talked about having a home office, and even imagined a playroom in the attic. When they reached the master bedroom with its view of the lake, Elowen knew this was their home. "What do you think?" Dorian asked softly, holding Isolde in his arms. Elowen looked at him, her eyes full of happy tears. "I think we found our home." That night, back in their apartment, Elowen and Dorian couldn't stop talking about the house. They planned changes, talked about paint colors, and dreamed about the future. When they finally lay down to sleep, Elowen felt more at peace than ever before. The next morning, the smell of fresh coffee filled their new kitchen on Mercer Island. Elowen watched Isolde, now 4 years old, help Dorian make breakfast. "Careful, princess," Dorian laughed as Isolde poured cereal into a bowl, spilling some. "Mom will think we're feeding an army." Elowen kissed Isolde's cheek and then Dorian's lips. "Good morning, my loves." "Mommy," Isolde giggled. "Daddy says we're going to the park today." "Really?" Elowen looked at Dorian, who grinned. "The weather's perfect," he said. Just then, the doorbell rang. Dorian went to answer it with Isolde following him. Elowen joined them, curious. At the door was a man she never expected to see again, Thaddeus, Isolde's biological father. "Elowen," Thaddeus said nervously, "I didn't know I'd find you here. It took me months to track you down." Elowen's voice was firm, though she felt nervous. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Thaddeus's eyes darted between Elowen, Dorian, and Isolde. "I came to say I'm sorry," he said quietly, "and to meet my daughter." The room went silent. Dorian gently said, "Isolde, why don't you finish your breakfast? Mom and I need to talk." Isolde nodded and left. Elowen turned back to Thaddeus, her voice shaking. "You have no right to show up after all these years. Isolde has a father, and it's not you." Thaddeus looked ashamed. "I know, I made a big mistake, but I've changed. I've spent years regretting leaving you. I just wanted to meet her." Dorian stepped in calmly. "Let's not have this conversation at the door. Come inside." In the living room, Thaddeus explained everything. He had been scared when Elowen got pregnant and ran away. Over the years, he regretted it and went to therapy to become a better person. Elowen listened, feeling both angry and understanding. When Thaddeus finished, he said, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want Isolde to know I'm here if she ever wants to meet me." Elowen took a deep breath. "Thaddeus, what you did hurt me, but it led me to Dorian and the life I love. I can't fully forgive you, but I believe people can change. If Isolde wants to meet you when she's older, we won't stop her, but until then, respect our boundaries." Thaddeus nodded. "Thank you," he said, tears in his eyes. Elowen felt exhausted and sat down on the couch. Dorian hugged her tightly. "You were amazing," he said. "We were amazing," she replied. Isolde came into the room. "Mom, Dad, who was that man?" she asked. Elowen and Dorian exchanged a look. "Come here." "Princess," Dorian said, opening his arms. Isolde sat between them, and Elowen said gently, "That man is someone from Mom's past who helped bring you into this world." "Like Daddy?" Isolde asked. "Not exactly," Dorian said. "Families are made in different ways, but what matters is the love we have for each other." As they walked back to the house, Isolde held Elowen's and Dorian's hands. Elowen looked at Dorian, and their eyes met. Without saying a word, they both knew something special. No matter what happened in the future, they would face it together. That night, after they tucked Isolde into bed, Elowen and Dorian sat on the back porch. They looked at the stars shining above and the calm lake below. "You know," Dorian said softly, Today made me think about family and the future. Elowen turned to him, curious. What do you mean? Dorian smiled and held her hand. I've been thinking, maybe it's time to make it official. Elowen Carter, will you marry me? Elowen's eyes filled with happy tears. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times yes. They kissed under the starry sky, and Elowen felt so happy. She knew they could face anything together. The future felt bright and full of new adventures, and Elowen couldn't wait to see what would happen next. A soft sound of classical music filled the air. Laughter, chatting, and the clinking of glasses came from the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel in Seattle. The room was decorated with white and gold flowers, and candles flickered on every table. In another room nearby, Elowen stood in front of a big mirror. She was wearing a beautiful wedding dress made of lace. The top of the dress fit her perfectly, and the skirt flowed like a dream. Her hair was tied up in a bun with little white flowers tucked in. You look so beautiful, said Maricela, Elowen's best friend and Isolde's godmother. She adjusted Elowen's veil. Elowen smiled nervously. Her heart was beating fast. I can't believe this day is finally here. The door opened quietly, and Isolde walked in. She was 6 years old and wore a tiny, pretty bridesmaid dress. Mom, you look like a princess, Isolde said. Elowen knelt down and hugged her gently so she wouldn't wrinkle her dress. And you, my love, look like a magical fairy. Just then there was a knock on the door. Can I come in? Dorian's voice called. Maricela laughed. No way, it's bad luck for the groom to see the bride before the wedding. Not even for a minute? Dorian asked, making Elowen and Isolde laugh. Go get ready, Elowen said, smiling. We'll see you at the altar. Soon it was time for the wedding. Isolde walked ahead, scattering flower petals. Elowen walked down the aisle, holding her breath. When her eyes met Dorian's, it felt like the whole world disappeared. Dorian stood at the altar, looking so handsome in his tuxedo, but what made Elowen's heart flutter was his big, warm smile, the same smile that had brightened her hardest days. When Elowen reached the altar, Dorian held her hands and whispered, You look stunning. The ceremony was full of emotions. They said their vows, laughing and crying. Then they shared a kiss that made their love official. At the reception, they had their first dance as husband and wife. Elowen rested her head on Dorian's shoulder. Are you happy? Dorian asked softly. More than I ever thought I could be, she replied, looking into his eyes. You've given me everything, a family, a home, a future. Dorian smiled, and you've given me so much more. You gave me a reason to live and to be better every day. They danced across the floor, spinning and laughing. Elowen saw Isolde dancing with Dorian's father, giggling as he twirled her around. Elowen's heart felt full of love. The night went on with so many happy moments. Maricela gave a heartfelt speech. Dorian had a fun father-daughter dance with Isolde, and Maricela caught the bouquet by surprise. When it was time to leave for their honeymoon, Elowen knelt down to hug Isolde. Be good for Grandma and Grandpa, okay? Mommy and Daddy will be back soon. Isolde nodded, her little eyes sparkling. I will, Mom. I love you. I love you too, my angel, Elowen said, kissing Isolde's forehead. As the car took them to the airport, Elowen leaned into Dorian's arms. She thought about everything that had happened. What are you thinking about? Dorian asked softly. About how life is so surprising, she said. If someone had told me on that rainy night in Seattle that I would end up here, I wouldn't have believed it. Dorian kissed her head. Sometimes, life's best surprises happen when you least expect them. Elowen smiled and closed her eyes, feeling safe and warm. Then she opened her eyes and looked at Dorian with a playful smile. Do you know what else I'm thinking? She asked. What? He asked, curious. Maybe it's time we gave Isolde a little brother or sister, she said with a grin. Dorian's eyes widened in surprise, but then he smiled big. Mrs. Reeves, you always surprise me. Elowen laughed and kissed him as the car drove through the night. She felt peaceful and happy. Life hadn't always been easy, but every hard time had brought her to this moment, with Dorian, Isolde, and a bright future ahead. Eowyn knew this wasn't just a happy ending. It was a brand new beginning, and she couldn't wait to see what the next chapter of her life would bring. Thank you for watching. If you like this story and want to see more, please subscribe to our channel. That way you won't miss any new videos. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and share what you think in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. Also, don't forget to check out the other videos on our channel. We'll see you in the next story.